We are delighted to have a very strong panel that includes the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the Chief Executive of Hong Kong. And to moderate your session and to tie it all together and to provide greater clarity to the murky world of APEC and acronyms of the future of free trade, I'd like to invite your moderator, Mr. Andrew Stevens, the Asia-Pacific editor for CNN International. Please give Mr. Andrew Stevens a warm welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Could I perhaps ask everybody to take their seats, please, so we can get this session underway. We'll just wait a couple of minutes until the people coming in are seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our session is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, the session has begun. Please take your seats now.
Okay. Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to everybody here for this session, which I think is addressing one of the fundamental issues facing APEC, which is, of course, where to from here? What is the next horizon for trade in the APEC region? Where do we go to from here? Now, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice that with the failure of the Doha round of talks to the World Trade Organization, there has been something of a proliferation of regional trade deals. Many of them, of course, in this area. The TPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, APEC's own, very early days, but the free trade area for Asia-Pacific, all now on the agenda, so to speak, in spite of or because of the failure of the WTO talks, not clear yet. But certainly it does raise the questions, can they work together? Do these trade deals actually overlap and dovetail? Are they rival trade blocs? These are the sort of questions we're going to be looking at with our session today. And we're also going to be looking at the complementary policies, the policies you need to make trade work in this region. What's being done, what needs to be done to make trade better. And as you are aware, we have a very, very distinguished panel today. We have not one, two heads of state from two very dynamic and very open economies. So I would like you to join me in welcoming our first speaker today, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Mr. John Key. The Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, Mr. Leung Chun Ying. The Chief Operating Officer of FedEx, Mr. David Cunningham. And the President of the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Takahito Nakao. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your valuable time today. It is greatly appreciated. Now, I would like to start with Mr. Key, Prime Minister of, as I said, a very successful and very open economy, a country that 30 years ago was one of the more regulated, one of the most regulated economies, today one of the least regulated, who believes in open trade, a member of TPP, and also a member of the Regional Comprehensive Platform. From where you see it, being involved so intimately for so long with trade in this region, what's the vision? What do you see is the way forward?
Well, Andrew, firstly, thanks for the opportunity to be here on the panel. I acknowledge my panel members that are here. Look, I suppose as a starting point, as a brief bit of history, I mean, you're quite right, New Zealand was a very closed economy. Up until 1984, really restrictions on absolutely everything happening in New Zealand, and they had the impacts that you would expect. I mean, we really didn't, outside of probably exporting lamb chops and a few things off the land, produce things that were terribly competitive. And because of the changes that occurred in our economy with Britain going into the European Common Market in the early 1970s and the oil crisis, by 1984 New Zealand really was in a financially difficult position and had to change. And so from that point on you saw tremendous opening up of New Zealand and deregulation on so many fronts, and that really was pronounced when it came to trade. So in 1983 we signed CER, close economic relations with Australia, probably the most comprehensive trade deal that you can find. 16 years later, in 1999, we signed a deal with Singapore, and subsequent to then there's been a lot of different trade deals signed. In the time that I've been Prime Minister, we've effectively signed up all parts of One China. So the previous government had just finished the paperwork on the first OECD developed country to have a free trade agreement with China. We've extended that to all parts of One China, Hong Kong and Taiwan. We've also signed a free trade agreement with Korea, with Malaysia, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand free trade, and most recently TPP. So I suppose our view would be that for a country like New Zealand, 4.5 million people at the bottom of the world, no one owes us a living. We're certainly not going to get rich selling things to each other, and so we believe enormously in the benefits that come from free trade. To give you some example of that, if you look at the free trade agreement we signed with China, the estimated benefits for New Zealand were $115 million worth of tariff reductions and about $1 billion of additional benefits. When it comes to TPP, on a like-for-like basis, we estimate the reduction in tariffs to be about a $259 million benefit and a $3 billion overall benefit to the economy. The interesting thing with the China FTA is we outperformed that by 11 times more than what we actually thought the best modelling would be. And that's because the economists model this very much on a static basis of what the reduction in tariffs will mean, not what the elasticity of demand will be when consumers can buy those products at a much lower price. So from our point of view, we live in a world where we would like to see much greater capacity for us to trade on a level playing field in open markets. And so we are great believers in not only what's been achieved through TPP, but hopefully there'll be an extension of TPP with more countries joining. We're also members of RCEP, and we believe that's complementary, and we'd love to see that completed as well. But we are very strongly of the view that in a world where tariffs and quotas and restrictions aren't in place, countries actually rise up to that challenge. They obviously embrace that. Your companies become much more competitive on a global basis. It's a great thing for consumers, but it's also a very good thing for your own country. And we have never signed a free trade agreement with any country where we haven't seen benefits and extended benefits to both sides. And I suppose the last point I'd really make is that and the chief executive of Hong Kong doesn't need any encouraging this, as he's a rabid free trader like we are in New Zealand. But what I would say is that you will always get resistance to free trade agreements. Even in New Zealand, there were protests when it came to TPP. So I had protesters following me around the country for about 12 months during that period of time. I'd just simply make the point I made when I was at the G20 in Brisbane a year or so ago, which is you will always get those protesters. So don't sign up, I think, to a poor quality deal, because if you're just simply doing that because you think you'll get less concern and less protesters, it won't happen. Those people who are opposed to free trade will be opposed whether the deal is good, bad or indifferent. And I think we actually do have to strive for free trade agreements that actually materially make a difference. So if you think about TPP, for all of the challenges of negotiations, and the big sticking points were obviously agriculture when it came to intellectual property, particularly around pharmaceuticals and automobiles. When you look at what happened there, we've still seen from New Zealand's point of view a 93% elimination of tariffs over time. So a very comprehensive, quite high quality deal, and we would encourage more of that. So that's really our perspective on free trade.
It's interesting you mentioned that about the protest, because my perspective is, or perception is, that we really have moved a long way from Seattle and those big protests we all remember. There is protest, but much less so now, but that's a topic we will discuss a bit later. You mentioned Mr. Leung, a fellow free, open market trader. Mr. Leung, can you tell us, as a leader of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has this reputation as a very dynamic and open economy, what is your vision for the future? What is the right way forward?
We believe firmly in the further expansion of the economies in the APEC zone. I don't think we need to sort of talk about the virtues or the whys of promoting free trade. We don't even need to talk about what free trade is. Both Hong Kong and New Zealand, and there are many other economies out there, but the two economies that are represented on this platform have proved the virtues and the whys of promoting free trade. Going forward, what I think we need to do is to seriously look at the hows. I think the Doha round has not been successful. We need to look at the many plurilateral and bilateral free trade arrangements between and among economies in this region and in other parts of the world too. But I think while we, as the freest economy in the world, we've been ranked the freest economy in the world for 20 years in a row. We believe that we want to be a party to these agreements and making a bold statement, a general statement, we want to be a party in these, to these bilateral and plurilateral agreements. But at the same time, I think we want to be careful not to end up for the world, not for Hong Kong itself, in a situation where some of these agreements actually make things rather complicated and confusing for enterprises, particularly small and medium enterprises that prevail in many parts of this region's economy, including Hong Kong. I said at the beginning that I firmly believe and have faith and confidence in this region's economy because I think over the last 10 and 20 years, if you look at the volume trade that's going on in this region. And one example is it's the volume of trade between Hong Kong and the ASEAN countries, of which the Philippines is part. The ASEAN countries are now the second largest partner of Hong Kong's in the space of merchandise trade, only after the mainland China. It's now replaced the United States and the European Union as our second largest trading partner in merchandise. The economies in this region have been growing quite handsomely, and we believe in further growth in the years ahead, particularly as China's One Belt, One Road initiative is being rolled out. And we don't need to look at the map of the world to realize Hong Kong very much the gateway of that Belt and Road network. And so with that in mind, again, speaking from where I am, speaking for Hong Kong, I think there is all the more reason for us to promote free trade amongst the Belt and Road economies, if not other economies in the world too.
Thank you, Mr. Leung. David Cunningham, one of our panellists who couldn't make it today, sadly, because of what happened in Paris, was the Secretary General of the OECD, which has just put out a fairly grim outlook on global trade. I think the growth figure is 2% for 2015. I think the average number is 6%. CEO of FedEx, can you just explain, just tell us what conditions are like out there and what you are expecting on global trade. What are your models telling you?
Well, it goes without saying that our thoughts and our prayers are with all of those in Paris and in Europe who are dealing with some very difficult situations. It's impossible to imagine the issues that they're facing. Yes, I mean, I think, if you look at trade and you look at trade over the past 5-6 years since 2008, you'll see that there's been an increase in protectionism, there's been a decrease in trade, there's been a decrease in GDP. And
this is post-2008, the GFC.
I understand, but the point that I'm making, though, is that that's where TPP is so important in terms of moving forward, because just within this past 7 months in the G20, there have been over 119 protectionist measures that have impacted trade and trade flows. So that's why I'm so and we're so strong in support of TPP, which is an agreement that has defined requirements on the part of the participants. It's a high benchmark agreement, and one that we certainly hope that more will join up to it. But to your question, I think the next point that we need to talk about is that while the agreement is there, it hasn't been ratified or approved in any of the countries which have reached it, and that is the next big challenge that we face.
Mr. Nakao-san, as a developmental bank, as someone responsible for providing the complementary policies or helping provide the complementary policies of trade, if you like, to make the arteries and make the flow of trade smoother through infrastructure, through financing. Just give us your perspective on how the development of those sort of policies are coming in Asia.
First of all, I'd like to stress that the reasons this region, especially ASEAN countries and also East Asian countries, and now India and Bangladesh and other Southern Asian countries are now growing fast at the rate of around 6% overall, is because of open trade and investment regimes. There is no question about it. In the 1970s and 80s, some countries still had a more protectionistic attitude toward trade and also investment from abroad because of anti-colonization ideas, socialist ideas, and so on. But now they have adopted open trade and investment regime, and that is the most important reason China started growing very fast. Vietnam did it, and now Myanmar is growing very fast at the rate of 7 or 8%. So how we can continue this kind of momentum, and in that regard, TPP and other initiatives like RCEP, RCEP among ASEAN plus 6 countries, ASEAN plus 3 countries are so important. And ADB on our part is promoting this kind of momentum by investing in connectivity projects over road and railways, sometimes cross borders, especially Greater Mekong sub-regions. They are all connected among ASEAN countries. So we are promoting investment in the infrastructure over cross borders. The second is trade finance. We are promoting, especially after global financial crisis, we gave supported trade finance by partnering with more than 200 banks in the region through our private sector lending. And third is trade facilitations. We are promoting the ideas of better customs clearance, single window approaches, and so on in ASEAN countries and Greater Mekong sub-regions. So those are 3 main elements we are trying to support trade. Although trade growth is, as you said, now slower than the GDP growth, and it's not the case 10 years ago. The trade grew faster than the GDP, but we are now facing slower trade. It is partly because of a slowdown of China. The commodities trade is, slowing down even further because of less, commodity resource dependent growth pattern of China. So there is a slowdown. So how can we once again promote, encourage trade through these initiatives, and also by looking at the value change between countries, how we can foster value change in these countries, and also what we call a production network either way. So those are challenges to us.
I just want to open this up to more discussion now. And two speakers, both the Prime Minister and David Cunningham, did mention TPP quite strongly there. Prime Minister, to you first of all, can there be a trade deal in Asia Pacific that excludes either the US or China? Because that's what we have at the moment. We have a TTP that excludes China and RCEP that excludes the US. Is that workable, or do you have to make this work properly, do you have to have one overarching trade deal? And if you do, which one is it? Which do you think works?
Well, obviously you can have that because TPP has been concluded so far with 12 partners, and China's not part of that, and neither is India, which is again also from a demographics point of view, a huge economy and growing rapidly. But the question is that the best position, I'd say, well, that's suboptimal compared to having all of the partners, included in one grouping. It also depends on the existing free trade agreements you have. So if you take New Zealand, the big reductions in tariffs and benefits that came to New Zealand came in the countries we didn't have a free trade agreement with. So when we signed TPP, we really didn't have, prior to that, a free trade agreement with the United States, with Mexico, with Canada, or Japan. So that's where the $259 million worth of benefit came, and the $3 billion, because with a lot of the other countries, existing members, we had an FTA. So in our case, if China was, for instance, to join TPP, probably the benefits for New Zealand would be fairly small because we've already covered all of that through our existing agreements. But I think if you take a step sort of back, you have to say, as Chief Executive did, I think that the WTO process isn't working well. It's failing us. And there's no great sign that it's actually going to improve anytime soon. So in the absence of that, then we need these regional deals to be as broad as possible. And I think you'll either see a situation where other countries will voluntarily sign up to TPP, or alternatively, RCEP will come to fruition, and maybe they'll sit alongside each other.
They can sit alongside each other.
Well, they can.
It's not ideal, or it doesn't really matter, as long as there's a free trade agreement in there.
It's not perfect, and currently India is not a member of APEC, of course, so they're excluded. And if you think about TPP, its genesis comes from the APEC economies. I mean, I think in the perfect world, you get to a situation where FTAP is concluded, all of the 21 countries and economies that sit within APEC are included in a free trade agreement, and actually, bluntly, India would be part of that group because of its sheer size and significance. So that would be our ambition.
Mr. Leung, would you agree with that? I mean, in an ideal world, an overarching one trade policy, one trade deal?
In the ideal world, yes. I think WTO was an attempt at that.
And why did it fail?
We want to be careful looking at these and bilateral trade agreements and other plurilateral agreements, not to end up with or end up in a spaghetti bowl of trade agreements. Just imagine you are one of these small to medium-sized enterprises out there who need free trade arrangements on one hand, but sitting in this spaghetti bowl of all kinds of bilateral, multilateral, and plurilateral agreements. What do you do? I mean, it would be highly confusing. It might even be counterproductive.
And that's what we are seeing that. David, from FedEx's point of view, are you seeing this, the spaghetti bowl, if you like, where small and medium-sized enterprises are being penalised because of different rules applying to different free trade agreements?
Absolutely. I mean, I've sort of got one leg or foot that's been in Asia and in Hong Kong for the past 22 years, and I've got one that's back in the U.S. And so, you know, the great thing about a bilateral agreement is that it connects two countries and simplifies rules. The bad thing about multiple free trade agreements is the complexity. And where CY talks about small and medium-sized enterprises, think about the complexity of being in a market and trying to figure out the rules for this market and that market and another market without transparency, without digitization, without de minimis commonality and all these other issues that are being dealt with TPP. And it's incredibly complex, and you say, it's just too hard to work. But the reality of it is the small and medium-sized enterprises that do trade internationally, that do take advantage, are growing at a multiple of GDP. And those that, but it's a fairly small percentage. And when we think about programs like TPP, or what we're really trying to do is lift up, make it available to those small and medium-sized enterprises, which represent 99% of employers and half of employees in the world, make available to them what's available to global and national corporations, and that benefits all.
Mm. One of the other issues I think you'd have to say also is that every country, large or small, only has a finite amount of resource to negotiate these free trade agreements. So if you'll put as much energy into a bilateral negotiation as you will a regional negotiation or a multilateral negotiation. And even if you're the United States with all of the might of USTR, there's a limit to actually how much they can negotiate at one given point in time and how much political capital you can expend on that. So the issue is, you know, if one of an argument, New Zealand wants to have a free trade agreement negotiated with Korea, we'll have as many people on that as we almost will on TPP. So that's the problem when you're trying to negotiate hundreds of bilateral deals. You've just got so many people tied up. It's a highly inefficient way of operating.
Which brings us just back to this point about, it sounds the panel is in agreement that it would be for efficiency's sake and for clarity and for transparency to have one deal. And we did have a World Trade Organization. The Doha round, as we know, is not working.
Yeah, on that issue, of course, it's better if we can have one single worldwide trade agreement. But realistically, trade is bilateral. It's not like finance. It's more bilateral. So negotiation is needed between countries. And in that regard, I really appreciate the impact of positive impact of the TPP and also RCEP by ASEAN plus 3 countries and ASEAN economic communities. These arrangements would reduce the tariff. And among ASEAN countries, 96% of tariff line is already zero. And if we look at only ASEAN original 6 countries, it is 99% of tariff is already zero. So it means that there is a tremendous impact on lowering tariff. But in addition, I'd like to stress the importance of harmonizing intellectual property rights protections and also service sector regulations and the harmonization of dispute mechanisms. So from FedEx point of view, from company's point of view, the spaghetti bowling is a serious issue. But from the perspective of promoting lower barriers in tariff and non-tariff barriers, service harmonization, and so on, if countries make efforts to lower those bars, it would have a tremendous impact, and it would be paving the way for more global initiatives. So in short, I think trade creation impact versus the diversion impact can be tremendous. Although I agree that for the inconvenience of taking over so many different tariff structures and so on, it would cause a trouble. But overall, this is a way to go to the more liberalized trade system overall.
I was just going to ask CY, as Hong Kong, a founding signatory to the World Trade Organization, is there a chance that with this new round of trade deals that it will re-spark interest in getting the Doha round back on track, or is it actually taking it further away?
Well, I do see, despite the if like shortcomings or even failure of WTO, I do see the significance and the importance of having a multilateral trading system, such as WTO. It is very important because it provides stability and authority. I think we should not give up on WTO. While as if like a stopgap or one-off measures, we are reasonably happy with the bilateral and plurilateral agreements that we have. But these are basically sort of fallback positions. I think if at all possible, as a key proponent of free trade in the world with no barrier, NO, and not low, just low barrier for Hong Kong, we'd like to see a solid global arrangement.
Which would be under a WTO auspices, I guess. Yeah. Prime Minister, do you see the WTO as a spent force? Do you?
Look, we're either hopeful. I guess the only thing I would sort of say realistically is that the last successful round in the WTO was Uruguay, and that was nearly 20 years ago. And it's a long time between drinks. You know, I mean, we're kind of keen to make progress, and when you said earlier, well, why does it fail? I mean, there's no point in sort of pointing fingers at people, but inevitably, when it comes down to a free trade agreement, the sticking point is always agriculture, certain manufactured items like cars, and to a certain degree, intellectual property. And if you look at TPP, there were 23 chapters, but in the end, all the work came down to those 3 areas. That's why the Maui round failed, and it was what took a successful outcome in Atlanta, was to find agreement in that. And if you think about when Doha fell over some years ago, it in the end was the agricultural lobby that was stopping that. And so my only point is that to make a free trade agreement successful, you eventually have to burn some political capital. I mean, those 12 leaders that signed up to TPP, bluntly led by Obama, eventually said, we're going to do this. And it's not easy stuff for Shinzo Abe in Japan. It wasn't easy for Stephen Harper facing an election in Canada.
What about you?
Well, for us, I mean, we come from a little country at the bottom of the world. No one owes us a living. Most New Zealanders are of the view that we've been hugely successful as a result of free trade. So, yep, there were challenges and there were protests and there was some pushback. But to the point David made, I mean, our Parliament will pass TPP. It goes through a sort of vetting process and we'll get through there. I think he's right to point out there are real challenges of ultimately still getting it through the House in the US, but in the end, President Obama got TPA through, and I think in the end he'll get TPP through.
Let's assume that TPP is viable and it will get the correct ratification. The question I want to turn to now is the rules-based TPP versus the tariff/duties model, if you like. This is much more binding. The TPP is much more binding on labour issues, on environmental issues, on third-party arbitration issues. Perhaps I'll start with you, Mr. Leung. Do you see this more rules-based approach? As David was saying, it gives clarity for SMEs. It gives clarity for more people. Do you think that is the next way forward? Are we moving in that direction?
Hong Kong's very much a rule-based economy, and we welcome rule-based trade arrangements with other economies. But at the same time, I think the PPP has taken a high benchmark approach. These high benchmarks and high standards could become rigid, again, for two reasons for economies in Asia. Firstly, the Asian economies are dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises. And secondly, the economies in Asia are very diverse. I mean, Asia is very much a continent of contrast, and that definitely applies to the composition of our economies. It could become inflexible when it comes to application to each and every of the economies in Asia.
So you could end up with it being counterproductive, in other words.
Yes, you have yet to see TPP in practice.
Right, okay.
There could be rigidity.
But is it a point that, could you say that, as you say, it's a high benchmark, so therefore there is a benchmark, you must work towards that, get your house in order, if you like? Is that a way of looking at it? Mr. Lone?
Well, yes, I think it's good to set high benchmarks, and I think in the TPP arrangement we see things such as digital trade, e-commerce, and investment, and so on. And these, on the application level, could produce difficulties for Asian economies.
Nakao-san, can I ask you your comments on that? Do you see the rules-based TPP as the way forward, or should it be more based on just cutting tariffs and opening trade that way?
Oh, yeah, of course, there are many areas that we should work together to harmonize the system. And it's not just the tariff, which is important. Of course, we should have a harmonized system of intellectual property protections, and also the dispute mechanism and trade facilitations like customs clearance. So we should aim at more harmonized rules in countries. So in that regard, the TPP has provided a good model to go ahead, but to go in that direction. But RCEP, for instance, ASEAN Plus 6 initiative and ASEAN Economic Communities, they have a different kind of a set of approaches, but it's not necessarily not the rule-based approach. They are also targeting a rule-based approach, but with a softer, and also less speedier approaches. But we are going in the same directions, and that would help. But during that time of the process, maybe it would cause some trouble, difficulty to businesses. But of course, we should go in that direction.
John Key, as a signatory, obviously, to TPP, when the chief executive of Hong Kong says it could be counterproductive, how would you respond to that?
I think it depends on your starting point. So it's interesting within TPP, it's not universal everywhere. The rules actually and the tariff elimination varies within countries. And so it's not a stock standard approach everywhere. And so what I think actually is important there is it's firstly a lot easier for a country like New Zealand, which has high levels of transparency, open SOE procurement. All of those things make being a signatory to TPP for us a lot easier. Secondly, my understanding is that for countries that are emerging and developing, like Vietnam, for instance, they have more time, they have greater flexibility. So without that, it would be very difficult for them to sign up. The one area where there was some, at least, discussion, debate, pushback is around investor-state dispute, which you pointed out earlier. And the argument that gets put up around investor-state is that you lose sovereignty because ultimately, through a third jurisdiction, you can have a dispute between a government rule change and a private investment taken to a neutral arbitrator. Well, we've had investor-state in the last 4 FTAs we've signed, and we've never had a case taken against New Zealand. In fact, my view is you never will see a case taken against New Zealand because we're very unlikely as a government. There's been no experience across various successive governments where you've ever seen them make a rule change which is likely to have to be tested somewhere else. But actually, of itself, it's no bad thing that is there. I mean, if you look at the case that's there against Germany at the moment in relation to the nuclear power plant, actually the investors got a pretty fair point. On the back of a policy that was there, they invested a lot of money with the view ultimately to getting a financial return, and it's quite within Germany's rights to change its perspective on whether nuclear power should be available or not. But actually, if you're not going to be compensated for that, how and why will any international investor make those decisions? So, I mean, I think it just depends on your starting point, but in the end, people's appreciation and acceptance of the rules will rise over time, and I think that's a good thing.
Just on that point of sovereignty, let's take climate change rules, for example, that trade would be predicated to a degree on how goods are made to carbon footprints, yes. I understand. Isn't that a sovereign issue? Isn't that a sovereignty issue that it's up to a government of a country to decide what it can and can't do on climate change?
Yes, and I think ultimately, if you got to a point where any trade deal, TPP, RCEP, anything else, was so restrictive that you lost the right to make those calls or at least negotiate those, what should ultimately do is lock some countries out from joining. Because we're, all of us are heading off to, from what I can see, to Paris in a couple of weeks' time for COP21. You're going to have, well over, I think, 150, 160 countries turning up already with their own prescription for what their emissions target should be, and they'll all be different. And if you take a country like New Zealand, we have a, funnily enough, because of our agricultural produce, a developing country profile for very much a developed country. And we by definition have to go with a slightly different perspective than, say, another country that has a different makeup and composition of its emissions profile. So I think within all of these things, while you're trying to standardise the rules and standardise the way we operate with one another, and that's hugely important, the sort of stuff behind the border, behind the scenes, all this sort of stuff. You want all that to be able to flow as seamlessly and standardised as possible. I think within the agreements, you can actually have flexibility in there, and over time we'll reach the same sort of standard, but we won't all start in the same place, and we didn't in TPP.
David Cunningham, President Barack Obama has said on numerous occasions on the TPP that who will write the rules of the 21st century trade deals, and the US wants to write them through the TPP. Do you think, from what you see and what you're talking about, how small and medium-sized companies struggle, that the TPP is the best way to go? Well, and to CY's point too, about sort of a high benchmark for many countries, too high.
Well, I don't think it's the U.S. It's 12 countries that have agreed to write the rules for 12 countries, and then the question is who else wants to join in to that high standard that's been set? And so I do think it's the right way to go, and I think it's for the small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, the big companies have the ability to deal with the complexity and the duties and taxes and the tariffs out there, and they've been doing it for decades or longer. But it's those small and medium-sized enterprises that don't have that same set of resources where the transparency and leveraging of the digital economy creates an ability for them to participate in the global economy. Economies like Hong Kong and Singapore and others that are very transparent or very easy trade, New Zealand, where it's a half a day to open a business in that market. They've set the standard in terms of that benchmark. The other economies want to bring their economy along and open up access both in and out for their entrepreneurs and their small and medium-sized enterprises. So I think it's as a result of the failure of the broader types of agreements, this is a huge deal, a huge step forward.
But let me just add one quick point to this. The reason why I keep coming back to the importance of SMEs, why we should bear them in mind in forging new agreements, be they bilateral or whatever, is that they form not only the backbones of many developing economies, they will be the engine of the world's economic growth. And we've seen that in Hong Kong and in many parts of Asia. And more importantly, and we've experienced this in Hong Kong too, and a very positive experience, they are adaptive and flexible. And so we should bear them in mind.
Do you think generally that SMEs are looked after well enough in trade deals, or do trade deals tend to favour bigger companies?
Well, if you look at the other side of your question, I would say if we have an efficient and a user-friendly free trade platform for them, we'll see much higher growth rates in international trade and also domestic growth.
So you're saying that we don't really have it at the moment?
We don't have that at the moment, no.
Right. That's interesting. Mr. Noakal, do you see that too, that these smaller, medium-sized companies are being...
Yeah, of course, once again, those are small and medium-sized companies or even micro companies. It's more difficult to address complexity and the procedural issues of the TPP and other frameworks. But overall, if we look at the history of Asian development, the SME have been engines of the value chain or production network, and it was the basis of high growth of many countries, including in Vietnam and China. Of course, there are state-owned enterprises in those countries, but we cannot say that SME were disadvantaged in this process of growth. But in addition to just a trade arrangement, we should also look at how we can support companies and SMEs. We need to pay more attention to the financial structures, how we can invite financial inclusion for SMEs, and how we can have a more microfinance. So,
can you just speak to that, and how do you make it financially easier to get those companies access?
So those companies often have a limited access through trade finance and so on. So how we can help those small and micro companies to access to the trade finance, and that is a part of financial inclusion. And the financial inclusion is also to support those companies to invest for getting the advantage of these trade networks. So in case of ADB, we have been supporting partner banks including in the Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and so on, to establish a framework of microfinance. And we lend to those partner banks, and those partner banks then on lend to those small and medium-sized enterprises or even micro companies. So that kind of initiative should be even further encouraged in ASEAN framework, in the TPP framework and so on. And it would help the companies to deal with the opportunities.
And of course, you deal with developing economies. For a developed economy, do you need extra special policy for SMEs, or at that level, it is very much a level playing field?
We try pretty hard not to have special policies for our SMEs. I agree they're the engine room of growth. I mean, they're 95% of the businesses in New Zealand are big employers, and when they're taking on an additional 1 or 2 workers over time, that's what's really moving the dial when it comes to employment and the likes. I just think the problem, once you start setting those rules, it becomes very challenging, because company structures change and all those sorts of things. I mean, I think the only thing I would sort of say to you is I think free trade agreements help in terms of the rules around free trade by definition and all of the different complexities of that. But they're only one part of that. By definition, they don't fix all of the problems. And we have got lots of countries we have a free trade agreement with, but we're still constantly working with the officials on the ground in those countries to see our goods flow faster across the border. And the second thing I'd say is that to give a bit of credit to the ABAC members here, if you look at the behind the border reduction in costs and the speeding up in processing and all of those sorts of things, over the last decade there's been quite significant gains made. And I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what they are, but our guys will be able to tell you. And that's a practical result of the work that ABAC members have been doing over the last decade of coming to these APEC meetings and actually practically sitting around and saying, okay, when we send this particular good across this border, this is what we find and this is what we need to standardise, and there's been a lot of gains. So it's not just all your eggs in a trade basket. I think there's a range of things you have to do, and that's one of the real benefits of APEC.
It's a very good point. And to that point, have, for example, you come to this forum with a specific angle, agenda about that behind the borders development, further development? Is it an area which you see needs to be addressed more urgently?
Yeah, our guys would certainly say to you that they've been working on a number of different areas. I can't tell you specifically the bits, but they work pretty hard on that, and the meetings that they go through are quite practical in terms of actually getting to the real specifics of how documentation works, how these things flow, how you recognise that. And I think that's the big gain actually that you can get from something like APEC, where you have a happy marriage between not just the political leaders, because that can take you so far, but actually the very people that implement that in terms of your business community.
C.Y. Leong, perhaps I could put that same question to you. Is there something specifically at this APEC that you are looking for, Hong Kong is looking for, if you like, to help facilitate trade?
Well, we like to promote more and better free trade in the world as a whole. But more specifically, we like to pursue our discussions, which have been going on pretty smoothly with our trading partners in the ASEAN countries. We've been negotiating on free trade agreements with all 10 member nations of ASEAN. And we are hopeful, both the Hong Kong side and the ASEAN side are hopeful that these agreements could be completed, all 10 could be completed next year.
10 agreements, free trade agreements with the ASEAN countries.
Yeah.
David Cunningham, when you speak to your clients, what do they say to you? Is there a recurring theme about specifically something they would like to see addressed by a forum like APEC to make their lives easier? And I know you have been talking a lot about the SMEs. Is there one clear, ringing issue that keeps coming up?
I think we've been talking about it all day. I mean,
Right.
it's simplification, it's transparency, it's access to the rules on for the countries so that I can understand what I need to do to be able to import or export. I mean, in this particular case, the TPP has reductions in tariff barriers of about 18,000 different products that are being reduced. One of the things, you know, beyond trade in and of itself that happens with this is that all of the customs systems will be put online, and so there will be e-customs. Again, think about what we're doing with that. We're making it easier to do business for small and medium-sized enterprises, but what we're also doing is we're dramatically increasing the efficiency of customs organizations in the participating countries so that they can choose to look at the goods that they need to look at for safety or security or protection or for revenue purposes and not waste their time on de minimis value types of goods. So we speed up the economy as we go through with this. So, you know, this deal is very broad and has many different impacts, but that's what our our customers, whether they be big or small, make it more efficient for me to participate in the global economy.
Nakao-san, just on that efficiency and technology, how much is the ADB now putting into developing technology for emerging markets in trade to facilitate trade?
So as I said earlier, the trade facilitation is one of key area for us to support countries. And in addition to tariff reductions and the harmonizations of the regulations, the domestic regulations, what is really important matters is how the customs clarification, customs clearance can be speedier and more efficient. And to do that, we need to integrate better technologies, and also to have a harmonized approach to the customs clearance is so important. So we are supporting more e-customs, and also we are supporting the harmonizations of hygiene and quarantine regulations and so on. So
is you at the beginning or the middle of this process?
We are expanding that process together with the WTO or with the WCO, World Customs Organizations. They are so keen to facilitate customs clearance. It is becoming more and more important when we have a reduced tariff rate. What is impeding the smooth move of goods is customs efficiency. That is really important.
Andrew, I was going to make one point. I think, David raised a really good point about the online capability of processing goods. And one of the big booms for your business, obviously, has been online trading. And, of course, online commerce is huge. So, you live in New Zealand now, you don't just shop in the bricks and mortar shops down the road. I mean, you shop across the internet and across the world. One of the challenges, though, I think that we face is most countries have some sort of value-added tax. And at the moment, what's happening is that we've either got a high level of inefficiency because of very low de minimis rate, and so the goods are held up with the logistics company before the consumer can get them, or you have a very high de minimis rule, like Australia's at $1,000, New Zealand's currently at $400, and we're missing out on a lot of tax revenue, and we can see this enormous increase to online shopping. Not because people are trying to avoid paying the value-added tax, but because of sheer convenience and consumer choice that they get. And I do think we have to do more work in that space, because I think it's an inevitable trend. It's no bad thing, but you are going to see more and more consumers shopping online. Now, the OECD is doing a lot of work in this area where we're all trying to find a globalized solution for how companies can register and how people can actually legitimately buy online, pay the duty and the taxes that they're liable for, and actually have a seamless process. But we're going to have to do better at that, because with the greatest respect to some of these global multinationals, they are registering themselves in places where they can avoid paying taxation to a large extent. It isn't actually fair on what's going on, and actually we've got to get to a point where it's a simple process. We can do that, but we have to do it collectively.
And at what forum do you tackle this? You say the OECD is doing work on it. Is this an APEC an issue, a WTO issue?
It is, but APEC would be pretty narrow. I mean, yes, we cover 40% of the global economy, but fundamentally, I do think it's at an OECD level, and I think we have to work this out for the SME sector as well, because it's one thing to have these very big companies where you can register, but actually, truthfully, it should be a system that works for every business, large and small. But without it, it is going to challenge the tax base of countries. And if you take New Zealand, we have what's called goods and services tax, it's VAT, we're at 15%. I mean, that is quite a significant portion of our tax revenue comes from goods and services tax, and we're seeing quite major base erosion now because people are buying online. And I understand that, but that's just unacceptable to us, and if that means we've got to reduce our de minimis rules and hold everything up at the border, that's hugely inconvenient for our consumers, and it's not actually very good for your business either.
Yeah. I'm just curious, just on that point, to see why is Hong Kong being a free and open economy, do you think the New Zealand Prime Minister makes a good point, and that is something that needs to be looked at? Whoops.
It must be a good point from the Prime Minister's point of view, but it's not a practical issue that concerns us. We sympathise with the point made by the Prime Minister. Hong Kong is totally tax-free when it comes to transaction in the goods. Sometimes when I address an international audience in Hong Kong, I encourage them to pop into our shops and leave some money behind in Hong Kong, and often remind them. I said, when you leave Hong Kong, in the airport terminal, don't try to find a VAT, a refund counter. We don't refund VATs because we don't charge VAT in the first place. So it's not a practical issue for us, but I can see the point.
Okay, I would like to call for some questions from the floor. We are starting to run out of time here, but I would like to get a couple of questions in a week. There's a gentleman at the very front here. Sir, if you could just state your name and your affiliation.
Good afternoon. It's working. Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Rui Moreno. I'm with the National Competitiveness Council in the Philippines. My question is to the Prime Minister. I noted your remark when you said that New Zealand is at the bottom of the world. And despite all of this, you seem to have some kind of competitive advantage in terms of being able to trade with the rest of the world. Is this because of the fact that these are agricultural products? You know, you have been able to optimize the manufacturing of milk. I understand the cows are not touched at all by human hands. So. And also, of course, probably taking advantage of the shipping. But considering that it's the bottom of the world, what is the competitive advantage that you have been able to optimize so that you can enter into these trade agreements? Thank you.
Well, firstly, I don't think there's any doubt that we're a great place to produce agricultural products. We're the largest dairy exporter in the world. But interestingly enough, actually, we're not a terribly large producer. I mean, we're about 3% of world production, and the world is growing roughly at a New Zealand a year for dairy demand. It's just what's happening is that we have a very small population, 4.5 million people. So there's no question we've got arable land, good sunshine, very good conditions for growing agricultural and horticultural products, not just dairy, but obviously beef, wine, you sort of name it. But actually there's also been a big increase in the manufactured products that are coming out of New Zealand and to the export services sector. And I think if you're really honest about it, what's happened in New Zealand is that when we eliminated sort of the barriers to entry of companies exporting to New Zealand, we essentially eliminated virtually all tariffs and all restrictions overnight. Now that caused a huge amount of dislocation at the time, but it forced New Zealand companies to be competitive. And so when we enter a free trade agreement, we don't give much away because frankly you've already got open access to our borders. But it has made our companies be competitive. And I think any business person in this room will tell you that despite the fact that competition is an uncomfortable thing when you're in business, it's actually the thing long term that makes you survive, because it forces you to have best practice. And I think, to give some credit to New Zealand businesses, I think that they have learnt to adapt to a competitive world where they just got to compete and be productive and successful, or they'll go out of business. And I don't think it's just as simple as the fact that we're a good place to grow things. I think it's about a culture of the way you do things.
I want to support my New Zealand friend by saying that from the consumer end, it's quality as well. A few years ago, we imposed a Vellerum duty on wines imported into Hong Kong. We don't produce any wine ourselves. And then we decided to cancel duty on wine, so totally duty-free when you buy in the shops. So it's a level playing field. It is important. It's free trade again. It's a level playing field for everyone, whatever the cost of a bottle of wine is. Surprise, surprise. Over the last couple of years, the prices of the wine in the shops from New Zealand actually went up. Yeah. And that, given a level playing field, that's consumers' judgment on quality of products. And we do get some very good quality products from New Zealand. Thank you.
A nice endorsement. And I will also endorse Hong Kong's decision for dropping duties on wine.
Well, I don't want to rub it in, Andrew, as an Australian, but I will tell you the #1 selling white wine in Australia comes from New Zealand.
Thank you very much for that. And we won't talk about rugby either. There was a question over here, sir.
Yes, thank you. Mick Wilkes from Oceana Gold. We are a significant APEC gold producer, including New Zealand, the Philippines, and soon the USA. First of all, Prime Minister, congratulations on the World Cup, another great example of international negotiations.
I thought I'd just ban that topic.
But my question has been partly answered, and it relates to the fact that the free trade agreements are underpinned by the confidence of business investing in foreign countries. And surprisingly, there are a number of cases where there has been a breach of contract, and companies are felt forced to go to arbitration with governments on these issues, after spending many millions, tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, and then the rules change. And so that's a serious impediment to the strength and integrity of these free trade agreements. I was wondering what more can governments do to minimise these breakdowns, particularly when it comes to the smaller countries, where for companies, if it gets to that situation, it becomes a very serious reputational risk for the company, and therefore a very significant deterrent.
And you are addressing that question to?
Well, to the Prime Minister, it'd be good.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, in the end, if I can just talk about New Zealand, I mean, if you look at our country, we rely on foreign capital as an important leverage point for growth. So if we were solely to rely on the New Zealand capital base, we wouldn't have enough capital to fund the sort of growth levels we want. And so I think in the end, that's true for an awful lot of countries. I mean, most countries rely on foreign capital at some point. And I think that if politicians don't take that seriously, then what you end up getting is a situation where foreign investors will get burned, the reputational damage is huge, and the capital stops flowing to that country. And we can see lots of examples of that. So that's why myself, I feel quite comfortable about investor-state dispute resolution being part of an FTA, because I'm very confident that the government, whatever prescription they come from in New Zealand, will make the right decision when it comes to protecting property rights of foreign investors in New Zealand. And I think if they don't make the right decision, actually those foreign investors should have recourse for that. I think you should be free as a government to make the call that you want to change things. And if you take TPP, for instance, it's specifically excluded rules around tobacco and, for instance, plain packaging and intellectual property rights in that area. But I think, for the most part, if you want to see the flow of capital to your country, you actually have to give those international investors confidence, and the only way to do that is through the actions that you take as a government.
We've got time for just one more question. This gentleman here.
Liu Dongguang from Taiwan. I address this question to Prime Minister Key, and I invite other panelists to answer. I heard David said when different countries sign different FTAs, the big sufferers of that are all the SMEs. And as we know, most of the companies in our ASEAN countries are all SMEs and so forth. Prime Minister, you also said that it takes just as much time to sign a free trade agreement, sign a bilateral agreement, or sign a TPP. Andrew, you said that what good is a regional agreement if it doesn't have a United States or a China? Which leads me to think, well, maybe obviously we want TPP to succeed, but wouldn't the best solution be an FTAP, a free trade agreement over Asia Pacific? Now, my question is, what do you see are the roadblocks to a FTAP, and how can that be quickly achieved? Now, obviously, continue with TPP, but how do you progress the FTAP?
Just, if I could just quickly interrupt there, we are running out of time, and it is a very good question, and if I could ask the panellists to address that very, very concisely. Perhaps, David, if I can just start with you and just each panelist.
My comments would be that what I was talking about was complexity of FTA agreements when you're trying to ship or import from multiple countries. But what I think you have to keep in mind is don't let best get in the way of better. And it's taken 7 years to reach this agreement, and now it's got to be ratified. We know of a number that have already failed. So this is, don't let best get in the way of better.
Okay, CY.
Very essentially, I can see where Mr. Liu is coming from. Just that we sit back and reflect on the present situation. I think the situation is getting rather too complex, and adopt the marginal return or having more bilateral agreements. I think there's a case for that, FTAP. But with TPP and so on and so forth in the background, also in the pipeline, I think we need to pause and reflect.
I'm a bit more optimistic. I think what you've done with TPP is you've expanded out what was essentially in 1999 a free trade agreement between New Zealand and Singapore. It then went out to the P4. Now you've got 12 countries involved. In the end, there are 21 countries or economies in APEC. And I can't see why, having set that benchmark now, if you're really talking about FTAP, which is an expansion from 12 to 21, why those other countries can't make their own decisions about whether they want to join or not. And if they do, I think the other 12 should let them in, as long as they're prepared to meet the standards that have been set. And that is the fastest way to expand what was ultimately, 16 years ago, 2 countries coming together into a free trade agreement across 21.
So an FTAP, a TPP rather than FTAP, people joining TPP?
Well, I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel. I think if we all want to have to go back to square one and say, on the basis that it gets ratified by the US Congress and everything else, are they really going to, in the United States, want to go back to base one? I think you're better to say, we've got an existing foundation stone, and let's have other countries join that, and other economies join that. And that doesn't mean we can't renegotiate. I mean, we signed a free trade agreement with China back in 2008. We're very hopeful we're going to renegotiate that. It's been a great deal for New Zealand, but you can do better. But once you've established that starting point, there's always room to keep growing and improving that.
Yeah, I would like to broaden the discussion a little bit. And the trade regime is so important, and investment climate is so important. We should continue to pursue a more open investment and trade regime, including the possibility of APEC-wise arrangement, which should be, of course, wider and open. But at the same time, I'd like to emphasize that to promote growth and development, trade should be also in tandem with other efforts like infrastructure building. If we look at the Philippines, what matters is not just whether we have a low tariff or not. We need more ports and good highways and roads and railways and so on to support connectivity through trade. So in that regard, infrastructure investment is so important and still important. Energy is also important. So the ADB's operation, 80% of ADB's operations in amount-wise is the infrastructure investment. And we are very happy to have a cooperation with the new China-led bank of AIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And we are ready to co-finance with them next spring. We are happy to consider the first co-financing project with them.
This is a hugely important topic, and we have run out of time, but I would just like to ask our panelists very quickly, just closing remarks, just a minute or so, and please, Nakao-san, if I can start with you, closing remark.
Yeah, once again, I already mentioned the closing remark. That is
that's what I was wondering.
I thought there wouldn't be a chance. That's why I tried to broaden it. But anyway, what we need is the sense of cooperations in these regions, and I'd like to emphasize that this region has been, has enjoyed a benign environment of the stability or security issues, and we should make every effort to continue to have it. And that is a very important basis of a trade.
David Cunningham.
It's taken 7 hard years to get to this point with TPP, and now this has to be ratified by all the member countries. And so I don't think we have to be very careful that we don't take the eye off the ball in making this a reality. And as I said, this is a significant step forward.
CY.
Quickly, let's not forget trade in services, which is growing and getting more important for everyone.
Prime Minister.
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that if you want high levels of global growth, then we need freer, open economic integration. And the one way of achieving that is we need people in this room and those that support that view to be champions of that. Because if you want your government to sign up to a free trade agreement, you have to have some other voices in the debate that balance up the negative oppositional perspective. And we need the global CEOs to be vocal about how important it is, and we need the chambers of commerce and the small and medium-sized companies to do that, because it's too easy to find people that are negative. We actually need some countering voices to fundamentally to give politicians confidence to make the right decisions.
John Key, New Zealand Prime Minister, CY Leung, Hong Kong Chief Executive, David Cunningham, FedEx, and Nakao-san with the Asian Development Bank. Thank you all for participating.